Now, the other category is what we call unexpected conditions, and this can be anything, starting with acts of God, things like a fire or a flood or a hurricane. Acts of God is a term we use to in the law. We often refer to essentially natural disasters, things that happened that were not the fault of either party. We just came through a time in which there was something that happened that cost a lot of people a lot of money, and that was the pandemic. The pandemic certainly created unexpected cost, and it certainly diminished revenues. These were outside of the control of the parties, and so therefore, ideally, we address these items in our contract. Right now, there are thousands of cases across the United States involving people who had insurance for what was called business interruption, which is to say, in the case of a fire, for instance, if you have to close your business for 2 weeks while you clean up the mess and you buy new inventory, well, that 2 weeks you can recover under a business interruption policy with your insurer. Right now, all those cases are saying the pandemic caused the unexpected cost. The pandemic diminished our revenues to nothing. That's just like if a fire had struck, and therefore we are entitled to the 6 months of revenue that we didn't get because we were closed down, or we were locked down, or we were forced to take in fewer customers, or we had to close early. Finally, market forces. Prices go up, prices go down. There are prices that are relatively stable, but then there are prices that are very volatile. And market forces can create unexpected conditions. And again, the reason we are talking about this is these are all areas that you should incorporate, you should allocate within your contract. And contracts can shift the burdens of risk between the parties because the parties can contract with regard to any risk. If I believe that war is about to break out in the Middle East, well, in our contract, say I'm buying goods or I'm selling goods to someone in Saudi Arabia, we can include a provision related to that specific risk. Even though a war hasn't occurred and may not occur, we can still contract for it. And parties can contract with regard to risks that they have no control over, like a worldwide pandemic that shuts down the world's economy for a year, 2 years. So even if it's absurd or improbable, the parties can contract to those risks. And in fact, the parties can even contract regarding termination without performance, meaning we are going to end the contract. Both parties are going to walk away from the contract even though neither party has performed. The parties can contract regarding termination without performance. So a contracting system. What is a contracting system? What does it do? Well, a contracting system has to do 3 things. This collection of rules must provide the requirements of a valid contract. The first thing it does, provide the requirements of a valid contract, because we need to know if this contract is enforceable. And only valid contracts are enforceable. Now, a contract is formed in any transaction in which one or both parties make a legally enforceable promise. And as I mentioned before, contracts are enforceable promises. A contracting system must establish what kind of promises that society will enforce. So going back to that original hypothetical, I'm going to give you all $5 at the end of the semester. I promise to give you $5. Is that the type of promise that society will enforce? Well, we know the answer is no. Why? Because You didn't give me anything in exchange for that promise. That's what a contracting system does, is establish what kinds of promises that society will enforce. The second thing that a contracting system must do is provide guidance for the performance of a contract. It must provide the rules that allow a party to know when it has performed according to the requirements of the contract. They need to know with certainty, the parties must know when their obligations under the contract are complete. And if you fail to perform according to the promise you made in the contract, that's called a breach. So a breach means a failure to keep your promise. So whenever you hear that phrase, breach of contract, what that means is one of the parties has failed to keep the promise made in that contract. So a breach is a failure to perform according to the obligations of the contract or the contracting system. That's the second thing that a contracting system does. The third thing is it must provide remedies in the event of a breach. Meaning, if one party fails to perform, the contracting system must provide some remedy to the non-breaching party. See, it's the remedy that gives the contract meaning. If we enter into a contract in which you agree to sell me your computer next Tuesday for $500, and I promise to pay you $500 for your computer, and you show up and say, no, I never intended to go through with that. I'm not going to go through with that. If I don't have a remedy, then I have to walk away. The contract was meaningless because there was no sanction applied. So a contracting system provides the remedy. The remedy meaning the fix for the problem. And these remedies can take different forms depending on the nature of the contract. When we study remedies, you'll see that in our contracting system, the UCC, there is a strong preference for money damages. However, you could also look for a remedy like forcing one of the parties to keep their end of the bargain, what we call specific performance. So the third thing that a contracting system does is it provides remedies for the failure to perform, for the breach of a contract. Now, in the United States, different contracting systems apply. The primary source of contract law in the United States is what we call the common law. That's case law. It's law derived from cases that was heard in court. And we said that the common law governs transactions for services and real estate. Now, the second contracting system is Article 2 of the Uniform Commercial Code, which governs contracts for the sale of goods. So, Article 2, this law will govern virtually any business transaction involving the sale of goods, whether it is buying a bag of chips, whether it's buying hundreds of barrels of oil. Article 2, that contracting system applies. And then finally, the Convention on Contracts for the International Sale of Goods, the CISG, governs the sale of goods between parties of different nations. It's like Article 2, but on an international basis. And if you want to know more about the CISG, please sign up for my International Business Law course, and we will address in that course the same kind of things that we touch on in this course regarding the UCC. So in conclusion, what did we learn today? Each party to a contract has expectations, and make sure you know what the expectations of the buyer and the seller are. We know that buyers and sellers use contracts to manage risks, and we know there are 3 contracting systems in use in the United States today. Thanks for listening. I look forward to seeing you again.